Have you heard the chilling stories about the Stocksbridge bypass, one of the most haunted roads in England? These are incredible tales. Many people have lost their lives there. Let me tell you about the terrifying stories I've heard. In 1988, a new section of road was built in the north of England, running through the Peak District to divert heavy traffic away from a small town. But soon after construction began, reports of strange incidents started to emerge. In the heart of England lies a road so unsettling that even the most seasoned drivers hesitate to talk about it. The Stocksbridge bypass. On maps, it appears as just another stretch of highway connecting small towns. But for those who have driven it at night, it becomes a nightmare. The road was meant to symbolize progress. In the 1980s, officials decided to ease traffic and construct a bypass so vehicles wouldn't clog the narrow streets of historic Stocksbridge. Workers would start early in the morning and return home late at night. Everything seemed normal, until strange things began happening at the construction site. People heard children's laughter in the thick fog, though there were no villages or schools nearby. Sometimes, small figures could be seen running along the embankment, as if children were playing tag. But whenever someone approached, the figures vanished. Several workers swore they heard a children's choir, bright voices singing an ancient song. Each time, their hair stood on end. The melody was far too clear, far too real to be a trick of the imagination. The elders shook their heads knowingly. They remembered, centuries ago, there had been a monastery here. During the plague, sick children were brought in, most of whom never left its walls. Later, the monastery was destroyed, and their bones were buried directly in the ground, without gravestones, without prayers. Once, this was a road for the living. Now, it was a path for the dead. The most terrifying apparition was the monk. A black habit, a hood hiding his face. Several drivers and even police officers reported seeing him walking straight down the middle of the road, oblivious to headlights. Cars braked in horror, yet the figure passed through their bonnets and dissolved into thin air. The first accident occurred during construction. A truck carrying stone toppled off the embankment. The driver insisted that a group of children suddenly appeared in front of him. He tried to swerve but died instantly. Officially, it was blamed on fatigue and poor visibility, but rumors spread among workers, the road was cursed. The bypass quickly gained a grim reputation, not only for its paranormal activity but also for the number of lives it claimed. Thus began the story that would become known as the legend of the ghosts of the Stocksbridge bypass. They say every road has a memory. It keeps the footsteps of those who walked it, the blood of those who fell upon it, and the whispers of those who never reached the end. Some roads are ordinary, leading from village to village, from town to town. But others are different. They seem to grow out of darkness itself, demanding sacrifices in order to exist. Such is the story of the Stocksbridge bypass. At first, the land was nothing but hills and valleys, where morning fog lay so thick that even the sun could not pierce its cold blanket. Farmers and miners lived here, tilling the soil, cutting timber, but they always avoided certain places, especially where the ground itself seemed to moan underfoot. Ancient records spoke of strange burials in these valleys, of sacrifices made to gods in the age when bronze had only begun to ring in the forges. One old chronicle described how, beneath the stones lie the bodies of children, given as offerings to the darkness, so that the sun might rise again. At first, this was dismissed as myth, a tale to frighten young monks. But centuries later, when excavators touched the soil, the legend seemed to awaken. In the 1980s, the machines arrived, the roar of metal, the smell of fuel and hot asphalt. The plan was to build a modern road linking towns and sparing small villages from endless traffic. But from the very first day, workers began complaining. Some saw childlike figures beneath power lines, others heard chanting at night, songs that sounded like ancient hymns. At first, these accounts were dismissed as exhaustion. But soon, fear began to creep into even the most skeptical hearts. One worker swore his excavator always stalled in the same place, as though an invisible hand were pressing down on the metal. Another claimed he saw a hooded monk standing on the embankment. When they approached, no one was there. But heavy footprints remained in the damp earth, leading straight into nothingness. Locals recalled that long before the bypass was built, people often saw a ghostly carriage racing along the road at night without a driver. Its wheels never touched the ground, and the sound of hooves echoed like thunder in their chests. Sometimes, the cries of children followed, thin, piercing wails that made dogs' fur stand on end. But no one wanted to listen to legends. The road had to be finished. And it was finished. And that's when the real haunting began. The Stocksbridge bypass, open to traffic, seemed to come alive. As though it wasn't built by people, but by darkness itself, finally given form. With each passing month, accidents occurred, with each passing year, the death toll rose. People died suddenly, on straight stretches of road where mistakes seemed impossible. Many reported seeing a figure ahead of them. A monk. Or children darting under their wheels. Some spoke of a woman in white who would get into cars, then vanish, leaving only a chilling cold on the seat. Now, the road is called one of the most cursed in all of Britain. But perhaps the most terrifying thing is this. If you find yourself there at night, you feel the road watching you. Waiting. Breathing. It was November. The sun had long since disappeared beyond the horizon, and the hills of Yorkshire were drowned in thick, sticky darkness. In the distance, headlights flashed, a car was slowly making its way through the blackness. At the wheel was a young woman, returning home after a long night shift at the hospital. The clock on the dashboard read 2:51 a.m. The headlights caught a road sign out of the dark, a 616 Stocksbridge. The woman yawned and glanced into the rearview mirror, but there was only pitch-black darkness. And yet, a cold, irrational fear began to grow inside her. She turned on the radio, hoping to distract herself, but the speakers responded only with the sharp hiss of static. She felt a presence on the passenger seat, though no one was there. Then her eyes returned to the road. Her heart sank, a figure stood directly in front of the car. The woman slammed both feet on the brake, the wheels skidded, and the car with a crash flew off the roadside into a ditch. The last thing she realized was the silhouette of a person on the road, who vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The car crashed, the headlights went out, and the air filled with the smell of burnt rubber. Another life was taken. And it was not the first accident on this road, and far from the last. Since then, hundreds of accidents have occurred on the A616 section, with more than 25 deaths. Locals and researchers believe the road is cursed. It was built on unconsecrated ground, where monks were once buried and sinister rituals performed. The construction of the road was accompanied by inexplicable events. In 1987, two night watchmen heard the laughter of children. They saw a group of children in old-fashioned clothes dancing in a circle around a powerline pylon. And a few minutes later, they were confronted with the silhouette of a monk in a dark robe. Later, these same apparitions, the children and the monk, were also seen by police officers and local residents. People said the monk could appear directly on the road in front of cars, and sometimes he would sit in the passenger seat or the back seat, staring at the driver with his black, faceless visage. Over time, the number of victims grew, and now the Stocksbridge bypass is called one of the most dangerous roads in Great Britain. People still report visions, children whose voices echo in the darkness, a woman in white, a terrifying black dog with burning eyes, a harbinger of death. Which came first, a curse that causes accidents, or the spirits of those who died here drawing in new victims themselves? There is no answer. But even now, when passing along this road, many whisper prayers and try not to look into their mirrors. Because sometimes, you can see a passenger there, one you never invited into your car. When the Stocksbridge bypass was officially opened, it was advertised as the Road of the Future, a fast route that bypassed the old streets. In the first months, people drove along it out of curiosity, as if testing what it felt like to travel on a new stretch of asphalt, where the markings were still fresh and no weeds had yet broken through. But very soon the road received another name, the Cursed Road. The first case that was widely spoken about happened in the summer. 2 policemen were patrolling a section of the road late at night. The moon barely broke through the clouds, and the high beams caught only an empty strip of road and the gray hills on either side. Suddenly, one of the officers noticed movement. At first, he thought it was just an animal, but when he looked closer, he froze. A child was walking along the roadside. Barefoot. In a nightshirt. And strangest of all, his feet did not touch the ground. The figure moved as if gliding through the air. The officers stopped the car and got out. One called out to the boy, while the other shone a flashlight on him. The beam passed straight through the silhouette, as though through smoke. The figure stood motionless for a few seconds, and then vanished, as if dissolved into the night fog. The policeman returned to the car and, with trembling hands, started the engine. That night, they swore to each other to keep silent, but the rumors spread anyway. A month later, another patrol encountered the monk. Or rather, what they took to be a monk. A black figure stood right in the middle of the road, and the driver, unable to brake in time, closed his eyes, expecting an impact. But no impact came. The car passed straight through the figure. For a moment, the inside of the vehicle grew so cold that their breath turned into mist. The second officer turned around in horror and saw that the shadow was still standing on the road, motionless. From that moment on, the road gained an evil reputation. Newspapers wrote about mystical incidents on the news section. Locals tried to avoid driving there at night. And the drivers who had no choice but to set out in the darkness kept crucifixes close at hand and whispered prayers. But the most frightening stories began where legends merged with real tragedies. Construction of the bypass began in the late 1980s. It was supposed to be a routine job, concrete, asphalt, machinery. But the people who worked there remembered those nights for the rest of their lives. The first strange events were noticed by 2 security guards assigned to watch over the equipment. Their names were David and Stephen. That night, an uneasy silence hung over the construction site. Suddenly, from a distance, came the sound of children singing. Quiet, like a lullaby, but drawn out, monotonous. "Do you hear that?" one of them asked, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. The singing drew closer. The men pointed their flashlights toward the nearest power line pylon, and froze. Beneath the pole stood a group of children. They were holding hands, as if dancing in a circle. Their clothing was strange, old-fashioned shirts, woolen stockings, long dresses. The children moved in a ring, though there was no music. David wanted to shout, but the flashlight beams suddenly flickered, and the figures began to fade, as though dissolved by the cold air. Soon, nothing remained. But the most terrifying thing happened later. They had parked their vehicle near an unfinished bridge. The beams of their lights caught the concrete columns, and it was there that Stephen noticed a silhouette. A tall figure in a long robe stood on the bridge. Its face was hidden by a hood. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted. The figure did not move. Then the guards turned on the headlights, and the beam cut straight through the shadow. The monk vanished. Only a chill and the smell of damp earth lingered in the air. From then on, the guards began having nightmares. David saw the children coming to him in his dreams, staring silently into his eyes. Stephen complained that every night something walked through the corridor of his house. And that was only the beginning. Later, workers started noticing that tools would disappear. Heavy wrenches turned up at the far end of the site. In the cab of a bulldozer, they found wet footprints of bare feet, even though the machine was parked in a closed area. One morning, a dump truck driver said that at dawn he saw the monk standing right on the road. He was spreading his arms, as though blessing the highway. But when the truck drew closer, the monk suddenly appeared at the cab and looked inside. The driver's steering wheel locked, and only by a miracle did he avoid plunging into a ditch. After that, he refused to work on the site. At night, many heard the sounds of a crowd of barefoot children running nearby. Sometimes cries. Sometimes laughter. But whenever the workers tried to find the source, no one was there. People began whispering, the road was being built on cursed ground. They said a monastery once stood here, and further back in history, a place of sacrifices. Some claimed that bones were found right beneath the asphalt, but it was all quickly covered up. Officially, just rumors. But the workers knew, even before it opened, the road had already become something alien. As though it was absorbing fear, blood, and despair itself. May 13, 1988, a date still remembered in Yorkshire. It was a Friday. Crowds of people gathered at the new road to witness its opening. Politicians smiled, officials gave speeches, and cameras recorded every moment. No one could have imagined that the celebration would become the prologue to a nightmare. The morning was foggy. It seemed as if the gray haze refused to lift, as though nature itself did not want to see the road. Local elders whispered, "This fog is a bad sign." But the young people laughed, and the officials insisted that the new highway was a step toward the future. At 11 o'clock, the ribbon was cut. Cars rolled one after another onto the fresh asphalt. The road gleamed in the morning mist, and the first drivers rejoiced. At last, they were free of the narrow old streets. But the joy was short-lived. Within just a few hours, the first strange incident occurred. A red sedan, driving along a straight stretch, suddenly swerved sharply, as if the driver were trying to avoid someone. The car smashed through the barrier and came to a stop in the ditch. When witnesses ran up, the man behind the wheel was dead. His face was frozen in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. He saw someone, witnesses later said. It was as if the driver was staring at a person standing right in front of the bonnet. But the investigation showed, the road was empty. That same day, several more drivers reported the same thing. A shadow suddenly appeared in front of them. Sometimes it was a child. Sometimes a figure in a long robe. All of them described the same sensation of icy horror, as if an invisible hand were squeezing their throats. By evening, a thunderstorm broke out. Rain lashed the asphalt, lightning split the sky. But worse than the rain were the strange lights that appeared above the highway. Workers stationed by the bridge swore they saw figures of children running along the road through the downpour. Their clothes were soaked, but their faces remained motionless, like dolls. And every time a car passed, the children vanished. The first night after the road's opening was later called by police the Night of Horror. They received 5 separate calls from drivers claiming that someone had entered their cars. The accounts were the same: you're driving along the empty road, you switch on the high beams, and suddenly you feel someone in the back seat. You turn around, a dark, faceless figure. Some drivers fainted at the wheel. Others leapt out of their cars and ran along the wet asphalt until they found help. The next morning, newspapers carried headlines about an unexplained phenomenon on the new road. Officials laughed, claiming people were just seeing things. But the workers knew the truth. They had warned during construction, there was something here that should not be disturbed. Friday the 13th became more than just the date of the opening. It became the birthday of a new legend. From that day on, the road was no longer just a road, it became a living being. Insatiable. Waiting for new victims. There was a dreadful case with a nurse. A cold night wrapped Yorkshire. It was almost 3 in the morning when a young nurse was returning home after her shift. Fatigue weighed heavily on her, and the road seemed endless. When she entered the bypass, the world around her seemed deserted. Not a single oncoming light, only emptiness. Her headlights cut through the darkness, catching gray road signs and the occasional bushes along the roadside. At some point, the woman noticed fog. It lay ahead like a thick white wall, even though the night was clear. Her heart tightened, but she pressed the accelerator. She just wanted to get home faster. The car entered the fog, and the radio hissed with static. Invisible fingers seemed to run across her skin, the air turned icy. Almost without thinking, the nurse looked at the passenger seat, and her heart dropped. A boy was sitting there. About 10 years old, with a pale face and empty eyes. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The woman screamed and jerked the steering wheel. The car swerved, the tires screeched. In the rearview mirror, she saw even more figures. On the back seat, right behind her shoulders, sat children. 3 of them. All wearing the same gray shirts, as if from another time. Their faces were distorted by something incomprehensible. Not pain, not fear, but emptiness. She screamed, trying to drive the vision away. But at that very moment, in the middle of the road, right in her headlights, appeared a crowd. Dozens of ghostly children stood hand in hand, blocking the way. The woman slammed the brakes, but the road was slippery. The car spun, skidded off the highway, and rolled down the embankment. The last thing she saw was the boy in the passenger seat, who suddenly smiled, revealing eye sockets as hollow as pits. Her body was found only in the morning. Officially, loss of control, weather conditions. But among the rescuers, whispers spread. On the rear window, there remained the prints of small hands. Since then, many drivers have spoken of the children from the fog. Sometimes they appeared on the roadside, sometimes inside the car itself. Occasionally, they were seen playing beneath the supports of the bridge, where, before the bypass was built, there was said to have been an old chapel. And every time after such encounters, accidents followed. Accidents happened far too often, and far too strangely. A month after the road opened, a van crashed full speed into the barrier. The driver survived, but swore that a woman in white had darted in front of him. He never saw her face, only the long wet hair clinging to her shoulders. "She didn't look at me," he kept repeating, "she just stood there and waited." Police confirmed skid marks on the asphalt. The man had indeed swerved hard, as if trying to avoid a collision. But there was no one on the road. Then the first rumor spread. The woman was said to be the widow of a miner who had died on that very land, now searching for companions in the afterlife. 6 months later, 3 crashes happened in a single day. In the first, a car driver claimed he had been chased by a huge black dog with burning eyes. In the second, a young man returning from Sheffield said that someone had touched his shoulder, though he was alone in the car. He screamed, lost control, and hit the barrier. In the third, a truck plunged into the ditch, and before dying, the driver managed to whisper to rescuers, "He sat beside me, in robes, with no face." People began to call the bypass, the road of monks and shadows. In the first 10 years, 14 people died here. And almost every crash was marked by something strange. Some witnesses saw children in old-fashioned clothes, others dark silhouettes in the headlights. Some swore they heard children's laughter echoing from nowhere, even though the night road was utterly empty. And always, before tragedy struck, came the same thing, a sudden cold. As if something was draining the warmth from the air. Villagers in the surrounding hamlets began shuttering their windows earlier than usual. By evening, they refused to go out, not to the shop, not even to visit neighbors. The old folk muttered, "This road wasn't just built, it woke something that had been sleeping in the ground." Some claimed they had seen, rolling slowly along the road at night, a ghostly carriage. Horses without eyes, wheels that never touched the asphalt, and from within, the rattle of chains. Officials tried to explain it all away, driver fatigue, fog, quirks of the highway. But the death toll grew. Year by year, the road demanded its tithe. People whispered, this was no ordinary cursed place. It was a reaper road. It fed on fear and death. And each time another car sped into the night with a lone driver at the wheel, it seemed as though the darkness itself was waiting for the right moment to step onto the lane and claim yet another life. On the A616, few ever lived to tell of an encounter with the faceless monk. Most witnesses either perished, or lost their sanity. But once, there was an exception. It was in the late 1970s. A night route, an almost empty bus. The driver, a man named Thomas, later told police he had seen a figure in a black robe standing by the roadside. Believing it to be a pedestrian, he braked and flashed his headlights. But in the next instant, the figure was directly in the middle of the road. Thomas swerved in terror, narrowly avoiding the ditch. Passengers screamed, they too had seen the dark being. Yet each described something different. One swore it had no face, another insisted it wore a hood, a third claimed its eyes glowed red. Years later, almost at the same spot, at almost the same hour, 19-year-old Sarah was riding her motorcycle home. She would later swear that someone was sitting behind her. The weight pressed down on the seat, hot, rasping breath sounded right by her ear. She sped down the bypass, too afraid to look back, until the engine suddenly cut out, as if someone had pinched the fuel line shut. She crashed, but survived. When she was found, she kept repeating one thing: "He whispered a prayer to me, in a language I didn't know." Time passed. Thomas, long retired from driving, met Sarah at a gathering dedicated to the road's anomalies. They sat across from one another, and at once a grim bond formed. They both knew something outsiders could never understand. Sharing their stories, they realized it was the same figure. The monk. The faceless one. Thomas confessed that afterward he had begun marking accident sites on a map. He had noticed something strange: the points formed a symbol, almost like a cross, but crooked, as though broken. And Sarah added that ever since her night on the bike, the same lines sometimes surfaced on her skin, like burns. They stung whenever she passed the bypass. Together, they concluded, the monk was not a mere ghost. He was a guardian, a spirit of the land denied rest. Perhaps he had been murdered in monastic times, or buried beneath the road. But one thing was certain: the highway had cut through his place of silence, and now he demanded blood to restore balance. They resolved on a desperate act: to return together to the place of their encounters, and try to speak with him. They brought candles, old prayer books, and went to the spot where the horrors had begun. The night was moonless. The wind tore words from their lips, the candles kept dying. Then, on the center of the road, a shadow appeared. At first faint and formless, then thickening, woven from smoke. A tall figure in a robe. And where a face should have been, a gaping void. Thomas tried to recite a prayer, but his voice broke. Sarah, trembling, asked, "What do you want?" The silence lasted an eternity. Then in their minds came a whisper, not a voice, but a freezing thought. Blood. You built the road upon bones. Now the road is mine. At that moment, both felt the ground shudder beneath their feet, as though a living heart had begun to beat deep under the highway. When Thomas and Sarah heard the whisper, a freezing cold gripped them. As if the warmth had been drained from their very bones. The air thickened, viscous like water. It felt as though the road itself had come alive, a hollow thud, like the beating of a heart, rising from deep within the asphalt. In the next instant, the streetlights flickered and went out. The world dissolved, leaving only endless darkness, and beneath their feet, a single narrow strip of road stretching into the void. Sarah screamed. "This isn't reality, he's pulled us inside." Thomas didn't answer. His eyes fixed on the shapes emerging from the dark along the roadside. Figures, dozens of them, silent and rigid, all without faces. Only gaping hollows, seeping darkness. With every step, more appeared, rising slowly from the void, drifting toward the road like mourners to a river. Some stretched out their hands, others dropped to their knees as though in prayer. And suddenly Thomas understood, these were the souls of those who had died here. But Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "No, they're not just the dead. They're the ones who were meant to die. He takes them either way." The monk appeared again, looming ahead, and the road trembled under their feet. His hood sank lower, but there was still no face. Only the yawning void, pulling the gaze into its depths. He spoke. "You opened the gate. Now there is no escape. Either you remain, or you bring others." Thomas gasped out. Why us? We were only witnesses. The monk raised his hand. Before them shimmered a vision, a map of the bypass, marked with countless red crosses. But the lines no longer formed a broken cross. Now they shaped something else, a seal, a portal. Sarah felt it ignite within her. The scar on her skin flared like fire. He marked me that night, she whispered. I'm meant to be his vessel. Her eyes, for an instant, were as hollow as the shadows around them. Thomas seized her hand, but at that moment the road groaned beneath them. A fissure split the asphalt, and from its depths poured a rush of hot air, stinking of earth and iron. The breath of the deep. By morning, patrolmen found their car abandoned at the roadside. The doors hung open, the keys still in the ignition. On the fogged windows inside were only 2 handprints, pressed from within. There was no trace of Thomas or Sarah. But from that day forward, accidents along the stretch multiplied. Drivers spoke of seeing a young woman walking the shoulder, sometimes raising her hand to hitch a ride. Those who stopped were never seen again. And darker whispers spread, the road was no longer haunted by one monk. There were 2. One in the black robe. The other in a dusty driver's jacket. Long before the present highway was laid, there stood a monastery on that ground. Few knew of it, only the oldest villagers whispered the stories, as though they were not meant for strangers. They said the monks there were not ordinary servants of God. They guarded something that was never meant for human eyes. In chronicles found in a nearby town's archives, there were mentions of nightly litanies, when the brotherhood would walk to the cliffside and pray toward the sea. But their prayers were strange, not to God, but to those who stand between light and darkness. Archaeologists once digging in those parts unearthed a ring of stones plunging deep into the earth. The stones were carved with symbols, like crosses bound together with lines. Scholars called it asterisk, a druid sanctuary. Asterisk, but the locals were certain, it was a seal, holding something beneath the ground. The monastery crumbled with time, its stones carried off for barns and walls. But the road, laid centuries later, ran directly across that place. Asphalt smothered the circle, but did not destroy it. The seal still pulsed, and with every passing car it seemed to feed, on vibration, on rhythm, on blood. The figure Thomas and Sarah saw was no mere ghost. He was the guardian of the seal. Yet centuries of solitude had twisted him into something greater, and darker. He no longer only watched, he called, he took. At first, sheep. Then lonely travelers. And when the bypass was built, the flow of souls swelled. Each crash became an offering. Each scream of the dying, a hymn to strengthen the seal. Witnesses spoke of glimpsing, right on the tarmac, the outline of a staircase rising upward into the void. Some swore they saw shadows climbing it, vanishing step by step. But the stair did not lead to heaven. It led to where time did not exist. To where the guardian hoarded his trophies. After Thomas and Sarah vanished, police attempted an investigation. But they found nothing, except one strange detail. On the asphalt near their abandoned car lay 2 scorched handprints, as though pressed into red-hot iron. Years later, a retired major who had worked the case confessed in an interview. "We found something else. A stone jutting from the roadside, carved with a symbol, the very same as in the monastery's chronicles. I ordered it removed, buried in concrete. But that night the monk came in a dream. He stood by my bed and said, "You cannot seal the road. It already breathes." By morning, the stone was back. Since then, the place became known as the Road of No Return. Locals avoid it. Tourists, chasing thrills, seek it out. Yet those who dare to stop and step onto the asphalt at night all tell the same thing. First there is silence. Then you feel it, a heartbeat beneath your feet. And if you don't leave, faces begin to appear in the dark. And so, on rainy nights, when someone drives along the bypass, shapes sometimes step into the headlights. Sometimes a woman in a dusty jacket. Sometimes a monk in his robe. But if the driver slows, if he dares to stop, he is never seen again. Because the guardian still waits. And the road still breathes.